Anybody that has experienced grief knows how complicated grief is. Grief is sometimes unexplainable and it varies from person to person. So, two, three, four people can all be grieving at the same time, and their lives and their reactions and their expressions can look completely different. And that confuses a lot of people, especially if they've never been in that situation before and know what grief is like. Now, misconception about grief, or I think something people just don't talk about, is that grief is something you can experience not only when it's the death of someone or a loved one. You can experience grief from transitions in life, like leaving a job, getting fired from a job, getting laid off, from the ending of a relationship, um, from what you thought your life should look like, an old life you used to have, the life you thought you would have. Like, you can grieve transitions and expectations or disappointments as well, not just people. Okay. And so I want to address that from all capacities because a lot of people may be experiencing grief over certain aspects of their life and they're not calling it grief. And therefore, that's why they're still struggling and don't know what to do because they don't understand that they're actually grieving or mourning that. And so, and that's because of the misconception that no one died, so I can't be grieving, or what is this even? You can grieve other things. So we're going to get into the 5 stages of grief, what grief may look like for you, and maybe help you understand grief for somebody else that you feel like even though you've grieved, you don't understand why they're doing what they're doing or acting that way, and some other little tidbits that I think is important to know for people to better understand and support people who are grieving. I will say, when it comes to if someone has passed away, one of the things I will always say, and I've said in other videos, good intentions do harm. And so, because as humans, our human nature, we don't like discomfort and weird feelings. Is we don't know what to say when people are crying or when they're sad. On average, the average person, and so a lot of things people say when they're trying to comfort someone who is grieving, it actually is annoying or makes them worse. And that's coming from a therapist who has worked with a lot of grieving clients. And so when you say like they're gone to a better place, um, and things like that. It's like when you depend on what part of grief they're the stage they are on, they don't want to hear that. It's like I'm sad because they're not here. You telling me they went somewhere better does not change that I'm sad because they're not here. Like they're still not here. Like that's literally why I'm sad because they're no longer here. And you're telling me they went somewhere else and I should be happy of where they went. I want them back. Like, you know what I'm saying? But I'm sure people are trying to be positive and uplifting, but there's a time and place. And again, depending on the stage of grief they're in, saying stuff like that is not as uplifting as you think. It's annoying and it can be invalidating. So, no foul, no harm if you've done that. If you're like, you didn't know, I'm assuming. Let's just go with that. So, the 5 main stages of grief, what I learned when I was in school for psychology. A lot of things you can look on the internet and they've rewritten, added, changed things. I talk about the stuff from the original theorists and theories. I'm not saying other stuff is wrong. I'm just saying a lot of things are adaptations from the original based on just the changes in society over time. So, whatever helps you sleep at night, but I like to stick to the research. Okay. So, I'm going over the 5 stages of grief. If you Googled it and found out there were seven, if those seven make sense to you, by all means. So, the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Okay? I want to say and make this very clear, those are the stages in which they're usually listed, but they are not listed in order. So I don't want you to think like you go through one, two, three, four, five. People go through these stages in various order. Some people are on certain stages longer than others. Some people go back and forth from different stages. So it's not like I go from denial to anger to bargaining. It's not a hierarchy. Those are just, it's just a, they're just numbered. There's 5 of them. You can start with the fifth one. You can start with the third one. You can be in 4 and 5 at the same time. Someone can just have passed and you be on, you're working on the second one and they're on the fourth one. It's not going to say like you're going to go through denial first. Now, denial does tend to be the first one usually, but when there's a lot of shock and depending on the relationship, it may not be first. So, denial is simply when you're just like, I can't believe it. Just that shock factor of He's really gone. He's really gone. This is really over. This is no longer my life. And you're just kind of confused on now what? Because you can't believe what happened. Like, but it hasn't really set in. Like, technically, like, I know that person is no longer here. Technically, I know I'm no longer going to that job. But now what? Like, that's weird. What does life look like now? That's the denial part. Um, Anger. I think most of us know what anger is. A lot of people don't. Let's talk about it right quick. So, when I teach a lot of people about emotional intelligence and identifying their emotions, people do usually know what it's like to be angry, and a lot of people are angry all the time. But what people don't know is anger is a secondary emotion, meaning it's not what you feel first. It is something you feel more intensely and what you can usually identify before the other ones. But if you're angry, it's usually because you feel something first and it's led to anger. Anger is like unresolved other emotions. So, betrayal, frustration, disappointment, you're upset, you're sad, things like that, when they're not managed, turn into anger. Okay. But that was just a sidebar. Anger is the next one on the list, how I have them written. And you're just mad at the world. It's not fair. This sucks. What am I going to do now? What could I have done different? You know, it's just so many thoughts, so many feelings, which has led to anger, like I just explained. And you're not happy about it. You don't agree. There's no acceptance. You're just pissed off, quite honestly. And that's okay. No one can tell you can't be pissed off because it's not fun. You're not excited about it. The next one is bargaining. This is the part that really leads people into therapy, as far as I'm concerned. Like, this part is what takes the biggest toll on people's mental health, because this is where you were saying, I should have done this, and maybe if I would have done this sooner, or now you're playing the what if game in your head as if this was preventable or you could have done something different. And that's not to say that that's not true in some cases, but in a lot of cases in which people do this the most, if someone's got really sick or if you get laid off, things like that, things that were out of your control completely, there's nothing you could have done, but still people have that mental turmoil of, they kind of spiral out of control of, man, if a few years I would have made this decision, if I would have said this thing, I wish I did this thing first. I should have never done this. I should have done more of this. That's the bargaining, as if there's some type of negotiation of how this could have ended better. And that's just kind of your natural way of trying to soothe yourself, to find acceptance, to come to terms with what happened. Okay. Natural, natural, natural. This is normal. Okay. You shouldn't do this for too long, but it is normal to go through that. If you're just like, I keep beating myself up, that's part of the process, because it's hard to grasp the loss of something or someone, especially when it was unexpected. Okay, some of these look different depending on how they happen. Right. For example, because this is most common when people pass away, so I'm using that example the most. If someone got a diagnosis and you were told they had 2 years left, when you get that prognosis, you probably start grieving then. And people don't realize it until later. It's not until that person passes or get closer to passing that people are like, oh, I thought it would be more sad. I thought it would be more crying. And I'd say you probably already grieved it. You probably already started grieving it a long time ago. And we walked through that process. But anyways, so those 2 years, it gives you time to make peace and come to terms and accept this person. You kind of grieve before they pass. So then once it happens, you're like, I'm glad I did all these things. So you don't question yourself as much. You're probably not as angry, if you even are still angry, because you've already come to terms with everything. Does that make sense? I hope so. Another stage, number 4 on my list, is depression. And that is usually that bargaining, like I said, leads to a decline in mental health. All of this, to some extent, because it's utilizing your emotions, can lead to a decline in your mental health. But I'm telling you, when people feel like they could have done something, that lack of control really makes things so much more worse. But also, that anger and a resentment you may feel can also lead to depression. So many things can lead to depression. So now you're just down, like, no words, feeling stuck. Maybe you're to yourself. Now, let me be clear, depression doesn't always look like sadness. You could be now hyper vigilant. You could be hyper productive. You could be hyper independent. It can go either way, but you're just really not yourself because of this thing. Some people will go distract themselves, go back to school, get another job, work more, and that still could be a symptom of depression. Or some people won't see light of day until further notice. Their house is not clean. So just don't assume people are okay because they look okay or you don't see telltale signs. Check, do assessments if you can, follow up with people and be present, because that is depression in general is something that's easy to hide, especially if it's not look the way people think it should look. And then the fifth one is acceptance. And this doesn't mean you're no longer sad. This doesn't mean you no longer care. This doesn't mean you've forgotten about them. This simply means you've come to terms and you have peace. There's less anger. There's less denial. There's less of all those other things because it's like, okay, I need to move on with my life and there's nothing I could have done about it. Now you might feel like they're in a better place. At least they're no longer suffering. And you know you've come to terms with it. Now, the biggest thing most people who've experienced grief will say is that it comes in waves. You can think you're fine. You think you've gone through the cycle of grief, and a year later, 3 years later, 5 years later, something hits you like a ton of bricks, and you're just like, ooh, and now you're crying. A song comes on, and now you're crying. You see somebody, and now you're crying, or sad, or whatever, however you express your grief, and it's just like, what is going on with me? Sometimes people don't know, like, that's grief showing up. And other times people know, like, man, I thought I was doing good. It's been 5 years, I've come so far. Lighten up. You are doing good. And I'm glad you've made it 5 years without whatever that is or whoever that is. It's never gonna go away. You probably will miss them or that life or whatever it is forever. You're still human. It's just like with forgiveness. You forgive, you don't forget. You move on. It doesn't erase what happened. You will still remember that person or that thing in life. And there's going to be certain moments, because you're a human, that it hurts more than others. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you didn't resolve it. Sometimes it can. But in general, if you feel like you have done the work to move past it, it will just catch you off guard sometimes. And that's what makes it complicated. Because every time you think you're fine, you may experience or feel something and be like, oh, that still hurts. And that's okay. That's okay. So the other thing that is kind of a misconception about grief is people that don't understand or are just inconsiderate will say, it's been 6 months. Why are you still not over it? It's been a year. How long are you going to be crying about this? Shut your mouth. Shut your mouth. What do you mean it's been 6 months? What do you mean it's been a year? Some people grieve for the rest of their lives. Now, I will say, you can grieve for the rest of your life, but what it looks like should not be the same the rest of your life. It does happen, but you should not be on one of these stages consistently for years on out. You should seek help. Seriously, I'm being serious now. I know I laugh a lot. I'm very silly and I love talking about this stuff, but you should not be stuck for the rest of your life. But you, like I just said, you may miss them forever, and that's okay. So before you go saying like, "Oh, you're still upset about that," that's rude. Do not say that. Um, Even if you're shocked, keep it to yourself. Talk to your therapist about that. But those are invalidated, and then what happens is those people feel like something's wrong with them because they're still upset or because they're still grieving, and then I have to tell them, I totally understand. It makes sense why you would still be sad 6 months later. I totally understand why you're still hurting about this a year later, because you understand the dynamics and the nuances of their relationship or whatever it is. And there's no expectation, that there's nothing in the stages of grief that says you should be through all stages by this amount of time. If it is, let me know. Maybe that's changed. I don't know. But if you're going to prove me wrong, give me literature, not AI. Unless AI is citing the literature it came from. And I can say this from my point of view of someone who does literature, because there's a diagnosis for if you grieving a longer period of time. It's called prolonged grief disorder. So you can grieve a long time. Now, it is a disorder because it's taking you a while to get over it, but it also is a disorder because that means they've discovered that it takes people a longer time to get over it. Does that make sense? Like, you're not crazy. It's just you've been grieving intensely for a long time. Okay. And so I just want to free people of those shackles if they're just like, if you're beating yourself up, like, why am I still sad? Why am I still crying? Why does it still bother me? It's been 5 years. Because you really cared about that person or that thing. That's why. Because you're human. And if it is disrupting your life, if grief is disrupting your life, if grief is interfering with your ability to function the way you functioned prior, then you should seek professional help because it should not be debilitating. It can initially, but after so long, not a specific time period, because it's situation by situation, after a certain amount of time, if it is interrupting your life, you should seek professional help because you have to be able to function. Like life goes on and you're just needing help getting past that roadblock, and that's okay. Don't feel ashamed or embarrassed because you know other people that didn't have to get professional help. A lot of people are on medication. I always tell people mind your business. Don't be like how they're getting through this, how they're doing that. A lot of people are medicated and a lot of people are self-medicating. So worry about yourself and do it the right way. Do it, make the healthier decision. Now, let me clarify about grieving things other than the loss or passing of a loved one. So, when you go through a breakup, a romantic breakup, or even a friendship breakup, you can grieve that relationship, whether y'all were dating a year or y'all were friends for 10 years, because there's so much you're leaving behind. The relationship is what died in this instance. And so, even though you may not want the relationship back and you are maybe even glad the relationship is over because it's better that way, don't assume just because you did the right thing by walking away that there would not be grief. And I think that's what makes things worse. And that's what gets brought into other relationships because it's unresolved. You're like, oh, yeah, I walked away. And you're proud of yourself. And I am too, especially if it was unhealthy or abusive. But however, you still need to go through the process of what happened in that relationship and how it affected you and what you thought it would be like and all these things, because the biggest thing you grieve when you're coming from a relationship or out of a relationship or you get a new relationship is what life was like in the relationship. So it's you lost the person and the relationship and the life that was all tied to that. So again, remember, grief is complicated. Things are multi-layered. So if this is somebody you talk to all day, every day, your life has changed because now who do you talk to? Who do you call? Who are you going to go to when you're crying? Who are you gossiping with? Who are you saying good morning, good night to? All those things also go with that relationship, which is why people have a hard time moving on or cling to those relationships longer because you miss that stuff. After a couple of days, things are quiet and you're just like, you feel alone and isolated and you go back sometimes. You shouldn't, especially if you had a good reason to leave, but people miss those things, but they don't see it as that. They think they miss that person. You miss the interactions. This was the person you always try new food with, and you have all these memories tied to this person, and now that's just gone in the blink of an eye. You miss it. And so that is the grief of it. It doesn't mean you made a mistake. It doesn't mean you missed them or they were the love of your life or your soulmate. You missed the life you had with them to an extent, except the stuff that made you in the relationship. Okay. So I hope that helps. It can be a lot deeper than that, but I'm not your therapist. I'm just a therapist. So I'm just trying to give you some insight. Also, another big one that people grieve, and I think this is going to be my last example because there's many examples, and I think you should see a therapist if you feel like any of this resonates with you. But the last one I will highlight is life. If you if you had your life all figured out, and by 25 you were going to marry your high school sweetheart and then start a family, and you were going to be working for this specific job, making this amount of money by the time you're 30, and you're not 32, never married, no kids, no high school sweetheart, you're single, and you still haven't finished your degree, and you're living with your parents because you don't make enough money. That was very specific. I hope that isn't anyone, but it could be. Um, you can be depressed for one, and you also could be grieving if you are finding that you're having more psychological issues because life is not going the way you thought it would. And people don't think of it in that context. You were grieving the life you thought you had. And if you were doing really well at one time or things were going the way you wanted to, and then suddenly they stopped or things went left, and now you no longer have that life and you're just into a new lifestyle that's different or less pleasant or less desired, you also grieve the life you used to have, even coming out of a relationship. Even you get divorced and you had someone that was paying for everything and did all these things despite whatever led to the divorce, you will miss, like, man, I really had it good in this way. And you're like, well, what does life look like for me now? And now I have to start over. And now you go through those phases of grief again. And so those are the big ones, but it can happen on micro levels. Um, you should get a professional to help you evaluate and figure that out, to know and help you understand if you're grieving and where you are and if you're resolving it well or healthily, because it's so complicated that most people do not really go through it the best that they could or should, and it can cause more issues later. And the last thing I want to mention is that I mentioned this in another video, but if I want to talk about grief when it comes to ADHD diagnoses, because if you have a child, especially a small child who does not understand the concept of death specifically, but this is, you know what, I say that, but also your children can grieve if their parents split very young too, because why do I go to daddy's house? Like, why is this is daddy's house or mommy's house, whichever. They can be confused about that. Um, but when they're grieving, grief is considered recent within 2 years. So again, there's no timeline, a specific one that says like, oh, you should only be grieving for 3 to 4 months. If it's recent, you can check this out. Within the last 2 years, children are more likely to show signs of ADHD because, again, if you go back to my video about developmental stages, they are not of age to understand and comprehend and make sense of death and what's going on. And no matter what you tell them, like, I still love your other parent, but they are now living over here, and you try to explain it to them and you try the age appropriate conversations that I also talked about in another video, they don't know what the hell you're talking about because they're 5. They heard you, but that doesn't actually like make much sense as it does to an adult, at least a healthy functioning adult. And so they may start acting differently. That's not always misbehavior, but just differently in general. And a lot of times their expression of grief looks like ADHD. So just be mindful if the school is pushing for testing, or you're just like, this kid won't be still, or oh, this kid won't focus, or this kid won't stick to a schedule, and you're seeing certain signs and you're like, something's wrong with them, they might be grieving. Not always. And two things can be true. They can actually have ADHD and be grieving, but just be mindful, get a thorough evaluation, get a second opinion, just so that it can be ruled out that they're not acting like this due to a specific experience like grief. And what that may look like, they may get a diagnosis and they need to be reevaluated in a few years, or the diagnosis may be delayed until they have some therapy around the grief and see if that alleviates some of the symptoms. So that's my little spiel on grief. I might have missed a few things, but those are the main things that I do want people to keep in mind. So hope this helps.